Good afternoon. Thanks for coming to our talk on Android and designing for application structure. I'm Rich Fulcher. I'm one of the UI leads on the Android design team.
And I'm Nagel. I'm an interaction designer on the Android team.
So let's just jump right in. So what do we mean when we talk about structure? Maybe the first vision that jumps into your head is the idea of an architectural floor plan. Here structure is what the physical components that go into defining what spaces are present, and also provide the support for any of the activities you might want to do in those spaces. But structure doesn't have to be as immediately visible as that. Our bones provide structure for our body. They provide valuable attachment points for the functions of muscles and organs, good stuff like that. Our applications are similar to both of these examples. We need to define the spaces, and we need to provide ways to attach functionality in just the right places. So the kind of particular thoughtful presentation of that is what goes into the application structure. A well-structured app has kind of at least three things. First, it's easy and efficient. If it were a house, the doorways would be the right width so you could go through them. The floors would be solid. There'd be ample light to do all the things you need to do within it. It takes advantage of proximity. So the kitchen and the dining room are connected together, and they're not separated by the garage. And then finally, it has navigational consistency. Maybe all of the front rooms are connected together, but the back rooms all adjoin a common hallway. So our talk is going to focus on how do you find these same types of natural structures for your applications. And for those purposes, we're going to start with an example. So let's say that we're going to design an application to find a place to get a drink nearby. And with this many developers in the room, this should be up on the Play Store by tomorrow night. You've probably heard the oft-repeated precept that form follows function. So it makes sense to first ask, well, what does my app do? And by answering that, you'll get a better sense of what the structure that is needed to support all of that activity. So is the answer to that the kind of 30-second stream of buzzwords you spew at the friend of the friend who might be a venture capitalist? No, that's too high level. That's probably incomprehensible as well. Likewise, it's not the list of every feature, every last function that the application is going to perform. That's too low level. It's too separated from the actual user goals. Like Goldilocks, we need something that's just right, just in the middle of those two. And fortunately, there are modeling techniques that we can use that give us that. One of them is use cases. And a use case is just a sequence of interactions between a system, or between an actor and a system, the actor being the users for us, the system being the application, that achieves a specific task or completes a goal. When you write out a use case as a narrative description, it might look something like this. So for barkeeper, we have a use case that we need to support, which is finding a bar. We might identify who the main actor in this use case is, what kind of things have to happen before we can get into it. But then the core of the use case here is just a dialogue, really, between the actor and the system. The drinker does this, the barkeeper app does this, back and forth, back and forth. Now, you can add a lot of extensions to this. You can think about variations of this task. You could have find a nearby bar. You could think about other post conditions for success or failure. I like to keep these just really simple. The value here is in the content, not the format. And you want to make it something that anybody on the team can author. There's something in use case modeling that's oft overlooked that is actually really helpful for application structure, and that's creating use case diagrams. Now, these are really simple diagrams. They just have three components to them. The first is an actor. The stick figure is the official parlance that they use to communicate that. There's the use cases, just the title of the use case circled. And then finally, there are relationships. Arrows that connect actors to use cases and that connect use cases to each other to form extensions. If you take a bunch of these and put them together, you get a diagram like this for our barkeeper application. There's a lot of content encoded into this, but it's still just arrows, circles, stick figures, a little bit of text. Use case diagrams are intentionally very easy to draw. They're not one of these fancy pants deliverables that gives a designer a leg up over the rest of the team. Everybody can kind of make these drawings. And they don't have to be captured digitally. You can just draw it on paper, on a whiteboard. You can use stickies. That's usually where I start. So the use case diagram is just kind of a very quick overview that anyone can decipher that gives kind of the overall description of what your app is going to perform. Now, I took a big leap to get to that point, so let me back up and walk through some of the steps that were used to create that diagram. The first is you have to take stock of everything you want your application to do. And you want to capture all of the actors, all of the different roles that they could perform within your system. And likewise, you want to enumerate all of the use cases that are going to be there. Just write them all out. You don't have to do the narrative descriptions now. In fact, you might not ever have to do them. You just capture everything you want this app to do in the user's terms. The second step is to prioritize them. And this can be very, very coarse. 3 categories. And it's especially important to prioritize the use cases. Which ones are really important, which ones are less so. Start to give a focus to what your app is trying to do most often or most importantly. The third thing is to get into sequencing. Both how do the individual actors connect to the use cases, which are the ones that they want direct access to, versus the use cases that are just kind of natural extensions of other use cases. I can't go directly to view bar details. I've got to locate a bar first. And then the last step is decomposition. If you have a use case that feels broad or vague or covers a lot of ground, you can split it apart, to kind of break it into smaller pieces to attack it more specifically. And this can be helpful because those smaller pieces might get reused by components elsewhere in your system, or might be kind of specific, have relationships with other use cases. You put them all back together, you've got the same diagram that we started with. Now, this is the kind of roughly the official UML format for a use case diagram, Unified Modeling Language. We can go a little bit further just by putting a little bit of priority into some of the strokes. We got that sense of priority during the analysis, so let's layer it into the diagram. Take the most important or most frequently accessed use cases and relationships and make them bold. Take the ones that are low priority, low frequency, and have them recede a little bit by just kind of dashing them out. Same diagram, but a little bit more content to it. And we already start to see kind of some of the key paths through our application that we know our app structure needs to support. A drinker needs to find a bar. They probably need one nearby right now. They want to get to the bar details and find out where to get there and make sure it's open. So we've used this use case diagram. It's starting to tell us about kind of our app structure, but what in particular can it tell us about the hierarchy? Or how can it help us describe what we're doing? Well, it can tell us when we have a broad hierarchy. If we have an actor who's connected to a number of use cases directly, all of equal priority, well, then those are all reasonable starting places for the user, and we want to make it easy for them to get from one starting point to the other. On the other hand, if we have more focus in our use case, if we see that there's one use case in particular that's more important than the others, then maybe we can have those less important ones be a little less directly accessible. We can make different structural choices in how we present our app between those two. And likewise, we might have this condition of statefulness, where different users have different priorities between the use cases. An example of this is the phone app on Android. When you open it up, it's in one of 3 states. It's in either the dialer or the call log or the favorites view. And those correspond to different types of user behaviors. There are still people that just dial numbers. There are people that rely entirely on the call log. And we want that app to kind of open into those conditions for those different types of users, those different actors or user roles. It can reveal depth. And depth is particularly important when you have these kind of deep chains of use cases that are truly separate, that fan out from each other without interconnections. In that case, if you have one section where the user would quickly want to navigate to a different section, your app structure needs to account for that. And finally, there's the sense of interconnectedness, where use cases come together from multiple threads, where there are these kind of hubs you know these are really important features that you need to work on. These are probably some of the hero moments of your application because many users gravitate to it at some point during the use of your app. So there's one last trick you can do when it comes to taking a use case diagram and starting to think about app hierarchy. If you take the use case diagram and you just kind of rotate it by 90 degrees, and if you think about each of these use cases as a screen in your application, you have a first approximation of what your app hierarchy could look like. Now, this isn't perfect. There are occasions where the one screen to one use case mapping isn't going to be ideal. It's a good rule of thumb for phones, but sometimes you'll bump into a use case that just has more complexity to it, so needs to devolve across a couple of screens. Or you might have a cluster of use cases that are fairly simple and can actually be addressed all within a single screen. But this is a good starting point for thinking about your app hierarchy. So let me turn it to Jens now, and we'll talk a little bit about what some of the common patterns for introducing hierarchy are.
All right, thanks, Rich. So of course, apps come in all shapes and sizes. There's a huge variety in purpose and complexity. But if you wanted to sort of build a blueprint, if you took all apps and tried to build a common blueprint, it would probably look something like this, where you have a top level. And the top level is, of course, the entryway into your app. It can be one screen, can be multiple screen. That really depends on what your core use cases are and how many of them you have. But the important thing is that the user really finds their main use cases covered here and is sort of guided down the structure in order to complete them. The top level is really about displaying functional breadth and establishing an identity for your app. So as you can see from these examples, just by taking a quick glance at them, you can really understand what this app is about, right? Then next up is category browsing. This is sort of where you drill deeper into your hierarchy or into your functionality. It's sort of the connective tissue that connects the top level and the bottom level. Category browsing is really typical to organizational hierarchies, such as albums, for example, or folders. And then the last level is the detail level. And that is, of course, where you complete a task, where you consume data, or where you write an email. And of course, the screens are very much depending on the data type that you're dealing with here. But out of all of those three levels, the top level is really the most important one in terms of your structural decisions. Your choices here really dictate how well users will find their core use cases covered and can satisfy them going forward. The top level is really about communication with your user, if you think about it. It's sort of your quick elevator speech of what the purpose is. Like in this example, the data of the screen quickly shows you, well, this is really about telephony. I'm all about making phone calls. But besides the purpose, it also introduces the breadth of functionality, sort of how wide your app is. What else can I do? And here the other facets, for example, in the calling app are call history, and there's also the phone book, and I can immediately see that. So this kind of information should disclose itself as quickly as possible. So the communication here really needs to be succinct and to the point, because with all those apps out there in the Play Store, people might give up on you quickly if they don't see that oh, I can't really do with this app what I set out to do. They grab a different one that does a better job at communicating. So always be mindful that you're actually entering into a dialogue with the user on the top level screen. So allowing the user to explore the top level functionality is crucial to making sure that all your use cases are covered, like here, for example, in the current I/O app. Android supports different established patterns to just do that, to communicate what you can do inside of an app and to switch between the different facets of your app. So let's take a quick look at what those patterns are. First up is the six-pack. we call it informally the six-pack. It's essentially a menu screen that is the sole screen at the top of your hierarchy. And structurally, people have to navigate through the menu screen in order to get to the deeper levels where they can then work on their task. So they only have to, always have to traverse the screen. This can, of course, mean that if you want to explore multiple facets, or if you're not quite sure where to go in order to match your use case, you can imagine that there might be a lot of yo-yoing up and down could happen here. If I go to hotels, down, up to the six-pack, down to the flights, and so forth. So it's really a feasible way of solving the top-level navigation problem. It's sort of straightforward and simple, and everything is focused on that one simple choice of where to go next. And all the navigation choices really disclose themselves immediately. But if you look at it, it's not overly interesting to look at. Because after a while, people learn the structure of your app, and then they come for the data. And there's no data to be seen here, so you always have this speed bump before you actually get to the interesting stuff. Also, this is not accessible from lower levels. So as soon as you navigate away, you always have to navigate up in order to switch to a different facet of your app. Next up is fixed tabs. And fixed tabs is really a common pattern on Android. You can see that now we have 3 screens in the top level side by side. They're random access, so I can press on any tab in order to navigate there quickly. It's really fast and efficient. Since the tabs are a bit out of the way, you should always make sure that you support side swiping to navigate between the top levels quickly. In summary, what's good about fixed tabs is that they're really highly explorable, right? You see all the choices of the top level exposed in the tab, and it's ruthlessly efficient, right? So at any time, you can jump back and forth. So in instances where you write an app where you foresee people having to switch often between your top level facets, this is really a good control to use. Not so good is it's limited to 3 items because it takes up a horizontal space to put items in there. It also takes up vertical real estate, as you can see here. So if space is precious in your data segment below, then be mindful that you're giving away space by using a tab control up there. And again, it's also not accessible from the lower levels. So as soon as you navigate away, you have to navigate up to get back to the top-level navigation.
So spinners are a common alternative when you have kind of more actions than can fit comfortably into a tab. So the spinner fits properly within the action bar. You touch upon it, and a menu opens, give you all the destinations. So it can cover more than just the 2 or 3 that you would fit in a tab. It has some downsides as well. On the positive side, it's compact. You get a lot of options. On the negative side, those top-level options still need to be navigated back up to. So I still need to return to whatever level I'm presenting that spinner at in order to change and move to the different category. It's a little less efficient than a tab. It's kind of a touch and then a subsequent touch to make the selection. So it's a little less direct in that sense. And importantly, you're not revealing as much of the app structure when the spinner is collapsed. In an example like this, where it's kind of types of vehicle that I might be shopping for, the user has a good way of kind of thinking about that set. They have an expectation of, well, if it says sedans, maybe there are other things here that are minivans and hybrids and things like that. That can be less true when the functions are more disparate. If this category is called favorites, do I assume that all is also available there? It can be a little unclear for the user. So 6-packs, tabs, spinners have all been in Android for quite a while. And we have a new pattern that's been introduced recently that we need to talk about. And that's the navigation drawer.
And the navigation drawer. You might say, well, I've seen that in a couple of Android apps already. It's really been a community-driven pattern so far, but we now took the navigation drawer and sort of formalized its use as part of the Android design guide. So if you're interested in using this pattern after the talk, head on over to the style guide and take a look. There's also sample code available and a good developer section to it. So what is the navigation drawer? Essentially, the navigation drawer is a menu panel of your app's most important screens. So it slides on top of your content when you either tap on the application icon at the top while it's decorated with the navigation drawer icon. Or you can also do what we call an edge swipe. From the very edge of the screen, you can pull in the navigation drawer from the left. The navigation drawer really contains your, what we call navigation hubs, so places that users will likely visit frequently. Top-level views are always navigation hubs, so you should always include those. But now, since the navigation drawer is really a transitional element, you can now also include lower-level screens. So if you have particularly deep apps, now you can take advantage of the fact that you can bring up this menu from anywhere and provide links to deeper level structures as well. So all screens that are represented in the navigation drawer should actually be decorated with the navigation drawer icon next to the application icon. And that gives the user the signal, I can expand them here by tapping on the application icon. All other lower level screens that are not represented in the navigation drawer kind of retain the classic up behavior that we've had in Android for a while now. So the good thing about navigation drawers is also that it gives you a little bit more space to organize your content because it can also hold more content. So there might be a need for you to do something like this. So you can sort of add icons, for example. You can segment your menu using dividers. You can also add things such as counters. So for example, if the corresponding screen has new updates, you could say, well, you have 3 new messages in this particular screen if you go there. Additionally, you can also show collapsible items to organize lower-level content groupings, such as on the right, and allow the users to hide them, which can come in handy if you have a lot of items where a good range of them is subordinate to other items in the drawer. So in conclusion, what's good about the navigation drawer, of course, is it can display many views, probably more views than any other top-level switching mechanism that we talked about. It's also compact when collapsed, so there's really not much UI to it while it's collapsed. You know, once in a while you see the little navigation drawer icon in the action bar. It can include lower-level screens, which is nice because now you can sort of, if you have deep apps, circumvent a lot of the navigation work to drill into deeper levels. And it's, of course, accessible from anywhere. Slight downside is, of course, it's usually collapsed, so you have to open it in order to see what's actually in it. So after we have discussed all the different top-level switching mechanisms, we want to see where those patterns actually work best. And to do that, we want to play a little game of what if with you. So what if some of our Google apps use different switching patterns, and to see if that would work or not. And first up is Rich with the calendar.
Thanks. So Calendar, the app that many of you know and some of you love, some of you hate, currently uses the spinner as its top-level switching pattern. Perfectly suitable choice here. And the user has a very clear understanding of the relationship between days and weeks and months. So it's kind of natural to expect those other options would be in the spinner. It's very compact, fits up at the top neatly, titles the screen very nicely. So it's a good choice. We could have the calendar use the navigation drawer. That would also be viable. It's similar in a lot of ways to the spinner. It still has statefulness. It still kind of can provide a specific title to the display. I guess the one thing I'd caution against here is it makes the drawer feel a little underpopulated. You know, it has those 4 options within it. It's not likely to expand to include more options in the future. Maybe there's a year view coming. but not much more than that. And on a tablet or a larger form factor, that's a fair amount of empty space that you're creating just to kind of bring in this panel. But it would work. Tabs would be a poor choice for a few reasons. One is that most calendar users kind of fall into one camp or the other, kind of like our phone dialers before. You've got people that are very busy calendar users who live in the day view. You've got other calendar users who have much more sparsely populated calendars and they live in the week or the month view. The tabs are a great tool for when you're changing frequently, but that's not how most people use a calendar. And the downsides go a little further. By putting the tabs up there, you're doubling the amount of space that you're taking up for kind of the top level, just UI, structure above the user's actual data. So you're reducing the amount of content the user can see about their calendar. And then very importantly, you introduce this very unfavorable interaction with the gestures. A user might expect, oh, I can swipe from day to day to day, and that's a really natural thing to be able to do. But once tabs are in place, you have this conflict between, well, am I swiping from day to week, or am I swiping from day to day? And you have to make kind of a resolution for that, which may be unexpected to the user, given the context they're bringing to it. And then this six-pack or the dashboard is similarly not well suited. You can put all of those categories up at the top, but again, most users pick one and stick with it. They don't have to switch, and they certainly don't want to be asked to switch every time they enter the application. Jens mentioned the speed bump before. That's what this feels like when you use it. It also just kind of pushes the user's data down lower. I'm not seeing any of my appointments when I first come in. Now, there are ways you could kind of jerry-rig that in and just kind of put the first few appointments there. But usually, that's kind of not enough context. That's the kind of thing that a widget on your home screen is great for, or a notification. But the app should get to more of the content more rapidly.
All right, next up is clock. Relatively recent application for Android. So a clock uses tabs and efficiently communicates the other facets of the app. So it sort of gives you a heads up. There's really more than a simple clock going on here because it highlights that there is a timer and there's also a stopwatch. So it does a good job at communicating. Since the data communicates the purpose of the app nicely, we really don't need a traditional action bar that tells us the name of the app. As soon as you open it, you know this is a clock. Instead, the center view, the clock view, actually uses a split action bar and displays pertinent actions for that particular screen at the bottom, which also nicely visually balances out that screen. Vertical space is not a problem, so using the split action bar is actually great. Below the top level, as a small detail here, we talked about the split action bar, and that gives you access to two screens. One of them is the city select, and that is sort of a configuration screen to let you turn the clock screen into your personal world clock by selecting different cities around the world. So that is really a customization of that particular screen, so therefore being subordinate to the clock screen makes a lot of sense. Next to it, though, we have the alarm screen. And that really feels more like a place or facet. You could really imagine pulling that into the top level here as well if we wouldn't be going past the threshold of 3 items that we would like to see in the tab control. So let's keep that in mind when we look at the other options. So for example, if clock use spinner would be totally fine. Some of the options wouldn't disclose themselves as readily. But we could pull in alarms as the 4th item into the top level here as well. Switching between the facet takes a little bit more work. And now we're introducing text labels inside of the action bar at the top. And that sort of detracts a little bit from the aesthetic simplicity of the original design. The navigation drawer is a very similar story to Spinner. You can, again, pull in alarms, but you, again, have more navigational effort. The new options that you have around timer and stopwatch don't disclose themselves necessarily until you open the drawer. So in hindsight, if you put all of them, all 3 of them aside, all navigation mechanisms are sound and work okay. But the visual balance and simplicity achieved by the tabs is really what makes this our winner.
Okay. Bachelor number 3 is the gallery. Gallery uses a spinner right now, although it uses it in a slightly different way than calendar does. It's more of kind of choosing which way you want to view the same set of data. You know, it's going to be a set of photos collected in some different ways, and you're just choosing, is it by album, is it by kind of time or location or other facets such as that. That works well. We could use a navigation drawer, and it's an interesting pattern to think about in this case. You could just do the very basic thing where you do those same top-level categories and you can present them in the drawer. That works. You could push it a little further if you wanted. You could imagine making those categories in and of themselves expandable so that I could kind of, within albums, I could do my navigating for which particular album I'd like to move into. But I'll caution you about that. You know, at this point, you're kind of translating the way that you would present that content just to fit the pattern. Where using spinners, you would get thumbnails that represent what those albums are and what photos are inside it. Now you've just changed those same albums into text labels. And I think that's probably working against what you're trying to achieve in a gallery app, which is all about browsing that content and just kind of getting all those emotional triggers. Tabs wouldn't work all that well. You have too many things to kind of pack into the tab. You have the similar kind of constraints about the gesture that we saw in the calendar, where I kind of want to pan my photos, but now I'm panning through tabs, and now I got to make my photos go vertically. And the real estate crunch is especially bad here. You're packing in more space. Now I have smaller photos. Now I'm just not getting that kind of rich response to it. It may seem like it's a small amount of space. It's only 48 dips. But it makes an impact in your layout, and it can have a really dramatic impact on the experience that you get when you look at content like this.
So last up is Drive, which is Google's file cloud storage, as most of you will know. Drive made an interesting choice to use the action bar spinner for switching accounts. So this is totally fine. And we do this in actually a couple of apps. So if you, as a developer, feel that account switching is a relatively frequent occurrence in your app, then putting it into the action bar, into spinner control at the top level is actually good. But that sort of limits our choices, what we can do around the top-level switching problem. And the way that Drive solved it, they basically expose the top level of your file hierarchy inside of the content area. This is not really the top level of your file hierarchy because they are just static links. It's not your data. So essentially, it's a modified six-pack that we looked at the very beginning. We have no access to actual data here. It sort of makes it a solution, right? It would be nicer if we could actually do something like this, where we can get direct access to the data as we open the app. And here we're using a modified spinner. And we've done that in the past. And for example, Gmail uses a similar mechanism where one spinner actually controls account selection, but also does top-level switching. It sort of dilutes a little bit what a spinner really should be. Really, a spinner should be settings item with a single focus. So again, it's not super. But we're getting closer because now we can see data, which is nice. What if we use the navigation drawer? Now, this would, for Drive, really be an excellent choice because now we can, again, show data immediately. And the top-level navigation and account selection now can coexist in the same drawer. We could even give direct access to certain folders that maybe the user has starred and sort of surfaced as particularly important to them. So probably the best solution for Drive. We want to, in closing, spend a little bit of time to talk about challenges that particularly developers encounter as their apps evolve. So if you have an app out in the Play Store, you know that over the lifespan, you add a lot of functionality, you add a lot of new data and features to it. You should always be mindful of the structural impact that it actually might have on your app. Let's go through a quick example here. Imagine you build a really nice, simple, and focused sports app. And what it does, it covers 3 kinds of sports because they're sort of the big 3 US sports at the time that you were most interested in. And you can here switch between the sports. You can see the latest scores. You tap on a score and sort of see the detail of the game. Really simple, no need for settings, nothing, looks great. This is sort of what the structure looks like, 3 sports on top, and then they all point to one screen that shows the actual game data for something that you selected at the top level. People generally love your app for its simplicity, but they're also asked for change.
Yeah, once you launch the app, you're going to get feedback from users. And that's true if you're collecting it yourself from within your application. Maybe you're following some of the agile research processes from the prior talk. Or maybe you're just reading the always politely worded comments or reviews left on the Play Store. So you might get things like, Jens, it's Stanley Cup season. Where are my hockey stats?
So let's assume if I was a designer and I listened to all the feedback, this could be what my laundry list looks like of things to do. So I might want to add hockey and soccer as new sports. I want to segment sports that I already have into college and pro because there's a lot of college fans out there that ask for that function. People ask for a place where they can actually customize one screen to see their favorite teams across sports. There's requests for live score notification for their favorite teams so that they get a notification on their phone once a score actually changes. And in consequence, we sort of need a new place where we can actually set up the notifications as well as the favorite teams. So a first impulse is often to sort of take all that functionality and pile it on top of your existing top-level navigation because so far people actually like what you've been doing and nothing really technically prevents you from expanding the tabs up there by so many options. It actually works. And this is actually what you would be ending up with, right? By just adding new features to the app in the existing UI infrastructure. And let's see, are we happy with this? Let's look at a couple of problem areas. First off, if I like NFL football and soccer, those screens are now 6 swipes apart. So it's not really that random accessy anymore. It's not very speedy or efficient. Next problem is sort of glanceability. If I open this for the first time, what I see is my team's NFL football and NCAA football. Question is, do people discover that there's more hiding there? Because right now, all the options that we added are not disclosing themselves. Right? So people might look at this and say, well, I'm a hockey fan. I don't like football. So I go to a different app. We're at least at risk that people will not discover all the functionality that we've added. Next one is settings. So we needed to add some settings in order to manage our notifications and my favorite teams. And compared to the other top-level items, settings is not really an important place. You don't want people to traverse settings if they don't actually want to go there. Right? So it really doesn't belong in the top level. I should have quick access to it when I need it, but it shouldn't be part of my top-level structure. So the way how we usually solve that in Android is you have an action bar with overflow, and inside of the overflow settings is sort of an expected item where users will look for it. And that sort of lets me quickly dive in and out of it, wherever I am in the app, it's always available. So in putting all those problems together and in perspective, a better choice would probably here again be something like a navigation drawer, where you have quicker, more efficient top-level navigation. Your entire content is glanceable once you open it, because there's a lot of space for all the different items that I've added. It reflects the segmentation between pro and college sports nicely by putting it into this collapsible item. And it's future-proof, right? So this item is sort of designed to hold a lot of different navigation items. So as you expand your application in the future, it's sort of made for taking all that new functionality that you will be adding.
So just in closing, 3 points. First, you've got a ton of different options you can pick from here, but they're all suited for different purposes, and hopefully we've helped teach you a little bit about that. You really need to anticipate how your application is going to evolve. Don't design for the V1, design for V2, V3, V4. Be thinking of the long view when you decide your app structure. And then finally, challenge yourself. As you leave today, think about, for the apps that you've developed, if you used one of the different patterns that we've shown today. Would it be better? Would it be worse? Thanks very much for your time today.
Thank you.
We'll take questions at the office hours upstairs, and enjoy the rest of your I.O.